Welcome back. It's almost 18 months since John Key gave the education portfolio to Hekia Parata, despite the fact she'd only been an MP for 3 years. Ever since, she's been a minister under fire with negative publicity on an almost monthly basis. Parata herself says she was born lucky, and indeed a 3 News Reid research poll found the majority of voters thought that she was lucky too. Lucky not to have lost the education portfolio in February's cabinet reshuffle. So, should Parata have the job, or is she out of her depth? Our reporter Torben Akel took a close look at her background and asked some of her peers, has her luck run out?
She's in charge of a ministry that'll spend 17 cents of every tax dollar you pay this year. But just how qualified for that job is Hekia Parata?
She's well presented, she's articulate, she's very, very passionate.
Her civil service CV is certainly impressive, but is that enough?
Being in the bureaucracy is not like being a politician.
And is she just another victim of our merciless political media?
First they boast you and then they roast you. That's just the game that we're in.
On her website she says she was born lucky by being born into Ngāti Porou, an iwi with a history of education and achievement. Sir Aparana Ngāta is her ancestor and Parakura Horomia was her cousin. Her website outlines her own formal education too. Primary at Manutahi School in Ruatoria, a school which Labour closed down in 2001. Secondary started in Ruatoria too, but in Form 6 she moved to Gisborne, where one ex-classmate says she was a natural leader, a prefect who, rather prophetically, wasn't afraid to disagree with the teachers. Uni was at Waikato, where she got an MA and was president of the Students' Union. That's where Shane Jones first met her.
I think the first recollection I have of Hekia would be in 1980 at Waikato University at some marae. She was already trying to order us around way back then. And it was a gathering of Māori students. And what's the first word I'd use? Probably even way back then, sassy. But she was always ambitious and she had the virtue of being of a strong Māori family, proud of her taha Māori, and easy on the eye.
For her OE, she spent 2 years at our embassy in the States, as Sir Geoffery Palmer recalls.
Well, I first encountered her in Washington, D.C. when I was over there negotiating with the Americans over ANZUS. We had certain difficulties, you will recall, at that time about that, and she was certainly helping with the communications at that time, and that's when I first met her.
Within 2 years, she was back in Wellington working for Palmer and his Environment Ministry, helping with new laws like this, which let iwi claim back land sold with SOEs. So-called clawback provisions which, as it happens, will apply to state-owned assets being sold off now. Then Parata, at age 29, was handpicked to work on the Prime Minister's advisory group for David Lange.
If you're a senior Māori advisor in those days, you were engaged because of your networks. You were able to put senior Labour politicians in contact with sources of influence in Māoridom that they might not ordinarily have got access to.
Indeed, Parata's cousin, Tamati Reid, was then the Secretary of Māori Affairs. Her boss at the time, John Henderson, says she and Lange got on well and he was dependent on her when it came to Māori protocol, which he found frustrating. She advised him on issues raised by the National Party opposition, whose Māori Affairs spokesman was Winston Peters.
Well, I thought that she must have been pretty impressive because Lange wouldn't have chosen her to do that job. You don't just walk into the Prime Minister's department, an office, without you got some serious skills, and that was my memory of her then. Also, Hekia was always a very extraordinarily well-dressed and attractive woman, and there's not a proliferation of those sorts of people in the bureaucracy, you know.
Attractive and influential, a key player, in fact, in much of the historic Māori policy that came out of the beehive in the late 80s.
We had to try and turn the whole bureaucracy around. The bureaucracy was not sensitised to Māori issues, never thought of them. And you have to sort of, it's like turning a big ship around. You've got to say, look, guys, this is what it's about. Here's the treaty policy. Now you've got to go and think about it in the government.
She was a bit of a go-getter, and, you know, being a woman and someone quite young, I'm sure she trod on a few toes. But she was a part of that cabal of Ngāti Porou in Wellington, and ever since up at Anangata, they've always sought to maintain that position of ascendancy.
We're told there was even talk around that time of Parata standing as a candidate for Labour. Perhaps the idea of being on the losing side didn't appeal because nothing came of that. Instead, she moved into the state housing sector before getting a job at Tupuni Kokri as an advisor to its CEO, Wera Gardner. Within 2 years they'd married and she'd left TPK. Kids followed soon after, as did some bad press. First, when questions were raised about a TPK grant to a company headed by her brother Joe. The national government was satisfied, though, that the conflict of interest had been declared and that Gardner had distanced himself from the application process. Then in 1996, another potential embarrassment when it was discovered he'd bought 2 cars through his ministry with his own money but at a government discount shortly before resigning the year before. A leaked internal report said her name had been on the purchase orders. And while nothing illegal was found, both cars were returned for resale, with the proceeds going back to Gardner. For the next 5 years, the pair ran a private consultancy advising government and others on Māori issues. Then in 2001, he won National's vice presidency and she put her hand up to be an MP. Michelle Boag was party president.
But when I met her, I just liked her instantly. She's warm and engaging and articulate and very bright. And when I saw her being part of the National Party and engaged, I just thought, fantastic, that's the sort of talent we need.
Māori votes were what they wanted too, and Parata got 15th on the party list. But in the Labour landslide that followed, even that wasn't enough. Afterwards, she wrote about the experience in this book, how she'd struggled with the campaign's spending limit because of her, quote, penchant for spending, how it had taught her to grow a thick skin, and how eventually she'd be back. But Don Brash postponed that when his 2004 Orewa speech prompted this editorial outburst from her and this on-camera swipe from her husband.
Policy is heading in the wrong direction. It uses language which is outdated, and I think that the thinking behind it is flawed and not principled.
And while neither quit the party, nor did she stand for election in 2005. Instead, she had to wait till 2008 to fulfil her promise to be back, when she rode into Parliament on John Key's coattails. Her maiden speech made constant references to education, including this.
We must adopt an uncompromising attitude that failure is not an option.
Exactly 3 years and 2 days later, she was made Education Minister, despite having only been in Cabinet for 12 months. And it's been a rocky road ever since, from complaints over national standards to the class sizes increase and back down, to Nova Pay, Canterbury schools, and the early resignation and payout of former Education Secretary Leslie Longstone. Hardly surprising that in February a 3 News poll found 59% of people thought she shouldn't be Minister of Education. But is that due to her or the policy she's been forced to front? Labour's education spokesman says both.
One is that the government's overall agenda in education isn't one that's seen by people working in education as being positive. They see it as being bad for kids. They see it as being bad for educational outcomes overall. The second is, how does the government communicate around that? And that does come down a lot to the leadership shown by the minister. So in both areas, the government is very deficient.
But both Peters and Jones say the policy is primarily to blame for Parata's woes.
It's a desire on the part of the National Party, from what I see, to introduce competition into the education system, to rein in the power of the school teachers and their industrial advocates, and probably to create a situation where the market has more of a role in education. And whoever sells that's in for a hell of a ride.
You could be literally a political genius and you would not get away with this policy that they're trying to run. And I think if she'd have been clever, she would have resisted taking that portfolio.
Boag, meanwhile, says the problem is Parata's strong personality coming up against the unions.
She is an honest and direct person, and when she's asked a question, she'll give you a straight answer. She doesn't play political games. And the education unions play games all the time. You know, I think you've got this substantial, unionised, immovable force with a minister who desperately wants to change things for the better. It was inevitable that there was going to be some sort of conflict.
To which the head of the Secondary Teachers Union says this.
There are assumptions being made here that unions are simply about the industrial battle. I represent a professional body of teachers, and if she needs to get tough with the profession, I think that's absolutely the wrong way to start and the wrong way to get anything that remotely resembles good, sound policy.
Boag also blames the media for Parata's poor public profile and, broadly speaking, Jones doesn't disagree.
When you're in Parliament, you're in a den of blood sport, and when you falter or you make an error, it's not so much that you made an error, it's how you cope with the error that you've made. And education is a hell of a portfolio. I mean, it even hobbled my good friend Trevor Mallard, so that gives you an indication of how difficult it is. So once the media, I think, start to focus and you falter under pressure and under power, then unless you quickly arrest that, it just takes you down a kind of inexorable slope. And over the last maybe 6 to 12 months, I think that's what you've seen with Hekia.
So what's next on Parata's agenda and how best to climb back up that slippery slope of public confidence? Well, there was $9.7 billion in the budget for education, but strong indications some programs may be cut in order to fund others. There was also $19 million for those controversial charter schools. The day after the budget, Christchurch's council declared war on school closures in their city, but that didn't stop the announcement on Wednesday that 4 schools will probably be merged into one. While Parata deals with all that and more over the coming months, Boag's professional PR advice to her is this.
Just stick at it, build those relationships, engage those people, don't give up.
Peter's advice, on the other hand, is this.
Say to the leader, I think you've got to change the policy and then I'll be happy to contribute, but I'm not going to do that. Swallow a dead rat every day.
So suck it up, says Boag, and spit it out, says Peters. We suspect Parata will do the former. It was, after all, she who said in her maiden speech that failure is not an option.
All right, thank you very much.